Thank you very much. So my name is Samuel Gonahasa, and I work with IDRC, which is evaluating the impact of pyriproxyfen LLINs versus PBO LLINs on malaria incidence in Uganda. So by way of background, Uganda uses LLINs as the cornerstone for vector control for malaria, and the Ministry of Health has really been committed to providing universal coverage with nets. So far, we've had 3 mass distribution campaigns in 2013, 14, 17, 18, and then 2021. However, we are really challenged by pyrethroid resistance, which is, of course, threatening the effectiveness of nets. And we know that this resistance is mediated in different ways through knockdown resistance, metabolic resistance, and several next generation nets attempt to incorporate new compounds which can overcome pyrethroid resistance. So piperonyl butoxide nets are one of those, and piperonyl butoxide is a synergist which neutralizes the metabolic resistance mechanisms, and it can partially restore the susceptibility of these insecticides on nets. So in Uganda, we carried out a trial, which we called the LLINEUP trial in 2017-18, and embedded it in the universal coverage campaign. And it showed that PBO nets were superior to conventional nets for up to 25 months post-distribution. And at this point, we await a full recommendation from the Vector Control Advisory Group, on PBO LLINs. And as well, there are dual active ingredient nets, which are of interest now. They are newer generation nets, and they combine pyrethroids with, other chemicals that can sterilize or kill mosquitoes using different mechanisms. And one of those is the Royal Guard net, which has alpha-cypermethrin and pyriproxyfen, which is an insect growth regulator. So that really sets the background for the LLINEUP trial. And so based on the results of the LLINEUP trial, LLINEUP 1 trial, which we did, the Ministry of Health in Uganda decided to distribute PBO LLINs in the 2020-21 Universal Coverage Campaign. And so we set out to answer a question, are Royal Guard LLINs with alpha-cypermethrin plus pyriproxyfen more effective than PBO LLINs? So the study design is in such a way that the Ministry of Health agreed to embed this cluster randomized trial to evaluate the nets being distributed in the campaign. And so our primary objective was to compare the impact of Royal Guard nets to PBO nets. And our primary outcome for this is the incidence of malaria measured through health facility surveillance data through the MRCs, as Jane Francis has already talked about. So just to show the different sites of the LLINEUP study, we are carrying out this trial in 64 malaria reference centers across 32 districts. Jane has already described what the MRCs are and how they collect their data. How we selected these areas is there are places which are not receiving IRS, and they had already been selected by the Ministry of Health for distribution of PBO nets. And as well, there are places really with high transmission and burden and high levels of pyrethroid resistance. So this is this slide is to show the study design, which is a cluster trial. The cluster is is a selected set of villages which surround the MRCs, and LLINs were distributed in the sub-county, where the MRC is located. So the star is the MRC, the smaller circle is the cluster or the target area where we are doing the evaluation, but nets were distributed in the bigger circle, which is the sub-county. And so you can see that we have 2 MRCs there with their 2 surrounding target areas, and one of them is, assigned to Royal Guard and one is assigned to PBO. So we have, that is the way the study is designed. So how are we evaluating? We are using routine health facility-based data from the MRCs, which is individual level data from the OPD registers. And then we are estimating malaria incidence, and our numerator is the malaria cases from the target area during the time of interest. And these are lab confirmed cases, and they have been adjusted for missing data on village of residence and lab testing. And then the denominator is the population of the target area, which was estimated through an enumeration survey of all the target areas around the MRC. And then as well, we are doing cross-sectional community surveys, and these are being done at 12 and 24 months across all the 64 sites. We enumerated and mapped all the target areas, as I'd mentioned before, and then we randomly selected households from all clusters for a total of at least 50 households from each cluster, a total of 3,200 households across the study area. We administered the household questionnaire within the households to include measures of LLIN coverage and adherence. And then we did clinical surveys of children 2 to 10 years and collected a blood smear and a filter paper sample. And as well, we did hemoglobin testing in children 2 to 4 years, under 5. And we're also doing an economic evaluation as part of this, which is to answer the question, are Royal Guard LLINs cost effective? And what are the costs of distributing LLINs every 2 versus 3 years? So moving on to the findings, this picture is just really showing how the net campaign slogan, which was under the net, to really encourage net use. So moving on to the results, in terms of distribution, LLINs were distributed in the study areas, waves 3, 4, and 5 of the universal coverage campaign. And this was carried out in November and December, and then in March. So November and December for waves 3 and 4, and then March 2021 for wave 5B. And you can see in the map the different areas, wave 3, 4, and 5B. And you see it's a total of about 2.6 million nets that were 2.6 million people covered, and close to about 1.3 million nets distributed. So moving on to the results from cross-sectional community surveys at 12 months, which we have done across all the 64 sites. These were carried out from 22nd November 2021 to 31st March 2022, and we've covered, as I've mentioned, all the 64 MRCs, and we've enrolled about 3,500 households and over 16,000 residents, and enrolled about 4,800 children, between the ages of 2 to 10 rather. But we have microscopy results for children only in waves 3 and 4. So that's about 3,700 smears that have been read so far. Then looking at ownership, adequate coverage and use of nets, ownership of any net was about 90%. And there was no difference between the study arms, as you can see. And then adequate coverage, that is one net, one LLIN for every 2 residents, was much lower, between 56 and 60% for any LLIN. And then looking specifically at nets distributed in the universal coverage campaign, that was 51 to 55%, varying between the 2 arms. Most nets had actually been obtained in the recent UCC, and about 75% of the nets were used the previous night in the household. So looking at the clinical survey results, again, just to say we only have microscopy data for waves 3 and 4, we see that about 60% of children had a fever or a history of fever, nearly all subjective. This was by history. And were tested. So we tested all of those who reported a history of fever or had the temperature 38 degrees or more on clinical assessment. And we see that 55 to 60% of these had a positive RDT, which is really quite high. Then anemia, defined as hemoglobin less than 11 grams per deciliter, was about 35%. And then, for gametocytes, in terms of microscopy done in all children, we have, positivity rate of about 25%, but slightly higher in the Royal Guard arm and slightly lower in the PBO arm. And then gametocytes by microscopy were at about 4%, as you see. Now, looking at this slide, this is really reporting the main outcome, the primary outcome of this study, which is malaria incidence. You'll see that the x-axis is, is months, and this is really all sites. We collected this data from all the 64 sites, and we have the data 5 months before distribution of nets and up to 11 months after nets were distributed. Now, all sites were actually aligned on the graph regardless of the dates that nets were distributed. And then if you look at the y-axis, it's really reporting the malaria incidence per 1,000 person years, and you will see the blue line is the PBO nets, and then incidence in the PBO clusters, and then the red line is the incidence in the Royal Guard cluster. So you'll see that following distribution, malaria incidence fell in both arms. However, there is no difference between the 2 arms. So what are our preliminary findings at 12 months post-distribution? We see that household ownership of NNet is, about 90%, and adequate coverage of any LLI is actually lower. as you see the ranges. But when you look at UCC LLINs, it's even much, even lower at 55 in the PBO arm and about 51 in the Royal Guard arm. Incidence of malaria is you see has fallen in both arms after distribution, but there's no difference between the two groups after we've controlled for the differences in baseline malaria incidence. And then the prevalence data, as you have seen, the cluster level data really shows prevalence of about 25%. But really varies. It's quite heterogeneous across the study areas. Then in terms of the RDT, testing, we see that that's even much higher. You look at the cluster level data and it shows that's about 51% positivity in terms of the RDT. So my final slide is the policy and practice implications. The first is that this study design really highlights the efficiency and relatively low cost of embedding a cluster randomized trial into a national distribution campaign, and then utilizing health facility-based data to estimate malaria incidence. We think this is, maybe a good way to do these kind of evaluations. And then the second is that we really need to achieve and sustain high LLIN coverage. That's 1 net for every 2 people, by ensuring adequate numbers of nets are distributed through mass campaigns, and also maybe considering distributing nets more frequently via UCC campaigns, maybe every 2 years versus 3 years, and then strengthening routine distribution channels for nets. Then looking at preliminary clinical results, really it suggests that both nets are equally associated with an initial reduction in malaria incidence. However, we are not really able to draw conclusions about the impact on the parasite prevalence. Reason being, we didn't do a baseline survey. We were not able to include that. And also we just have results from some of the clusters, not all the 64. However, we really see that the prevalence is still high, with marked heterogeneity across the geographies. And then really our preliminary results suggest that more than LLINs alone will be needed, to achieve malaria control goals in Uganda. So what are we going to do? We are continuing with the MRC surveillance for malaria incidence, and then we are also aiming to complete, the blood smear reading for the 12-month surveys, and as well complete the 24-month surveys at the time point that they are due, and complete economic evaluation. And so I'll really end by acknowledging everybody who has contributed, to this work, all of those listed here. Thank you.